Okay, so today's topic is a wonderful, and extremely profound idea that I want to share with you, and it's a very deep idea that it's fundamental to how we practice Judaism, who we are as Jews. So we'll start it, and hopefully we could complete the full idea today. But listen with an open mind, obviously, as everyone always comes with an open mind, and feel free to ask if something is not clear, because it's such an important idea. So what we're going to speak about today, last week we spoke about where Greece and where the Chanukah story falls in among the four exiles that we're going through. And we showed how the different exiles challenge different aspects of what Jewish life is all about in the full, what's called in Kabbalah, the Kumash Lema, the full structure of the human being, which is a mind, which is seichel, a nefesh, a life force, a guf, a body, and those things coming together. The fourth aspect being the hakol, being the unification of all of those parts. And the same way that an individual has these dimensions and these realms, so too the Jewish people as a whole, as a collective, also have those aspects. Our physical existence, our existence as a free nation to practice how we want to practice, our intellectual capacity to believe what we want to believe, and then the hakol, the entire collective, all of these things coming together to create a Jewish people that exists, that practices, and that believes what we believe. So the four exiles each challenged different of those realms. The four exiles challenged those different realms. Devin, I see you. Welcome.
Thank you. How are you? Happy Hanukkah.
Good. We're just getting started. It's a great class that you're here for today. You're gonna love this one, so bear with us.
Thank you.
And I see we lost Trish. I guess maybe Trish couldn't figure out the technicalities. I hope she's not emailing me. I don't like when people have technical difficulties. All right, either way, it's recorded. Okay, so we said that among the four exiles, Greece is the exile that challenges us from an intellectual, ideological perspective. And it's Greece that challenged us to strengthen who we are ideologically, and even to a certain point adjust and change who we are ideologically, because as the ideology of the world changed, so too did the Jewish people as a nation, as an ideology, change in a way how we practiced and how we approached and how we believed. And we'll see that today. We'll try to understand that really in full depth today. But in order to really understand this, I want to give an introduction. The introduction is not Kabbalistic. The introduction is somewhat historical, and I don't want to get too caught up on the history or on the details. But I think that it's important for us to give more context, a wider context to the Chanukah story. Bigger than just the Greeks, the Syrian-Greeks, they tried to kill us, the Maccabees fought back, and we had this miracle of the oil, but to actually zoom out a little bit and show what role the Chanukah story played in the evolution of the Jewish people and why it came about exactly when it did. Because remember, the stories, all of the stories that we have, the stories are just a segue into the depth of what the holiday is supposed to convey. Good afternoon, Caroline. Good to see you. Okay, So for that, so just as an introduction, let's just look a little bit at Hanukkah from a historical perspective, and then based on that, we'll be able to get in to the little bit of a deeper message of Hanukkah. So I hope that you saw the handout that I shared with you in the email. I'm sorry that it was so late today. I was just a little bit thrown off today. This is last week's. Hold on a moment. Hold on a moment. I want to pull up this week's. My apologies. That's not what I sent you today, right? I sent you the second one, correct?
I didn't see it yet.
All right, so let me pull it up. Let me pull it up.
Rabbi, may you send it again, please?
It's just going to take me too much time to send it again, but I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'll send it to you again afterwards, or you can just
No,
look
not
back
now.
in your email.
Right.
You do have it, but I'll send it afterwards. I'm going to share my screen with you now, so you'll see it. Sorry about that. Okay, so if you take a look historically, the Hanukkah story, to really fully understand the Hanukkah story, we need to rewind really a couple of centuries and realize that the Hanukkah story happens during the time of the Second Temple. This is somewhat confusing to people because in the calendar year, Hanukkah comes before Purim. So people will often associate that Hanukkah happened before Purim, but it's actually not true. The Purim story happened between the first and second temple, and Hanukkah happened during the Second Temple period. But there was a massive, massive difference between Jewish life during the first temple and during the second temple. And that's because the first temple, if you want to get a sense of the nature of the energy in the first temple, the first temple was a time of prophecy. It was a time when prophets walked the earth in abundance. In abundance. The Jewish people had many. Obviously, there were greater prophets and there were weaker prophets. There were the big time prophets, right, that we know about, like Jeremiah and Isaiah and all these the major prophets were the leaders, but there were smaller prophets as well. There was like it's like you have today, like the mega superstars, and then you have like the cover bands. So they were like like the junior, the ones that opened for the big prophets. So I mean that's the way it was. It was the nature. It wasn't such a bizarre concept like we look at it today, where we don't have prophecy at all. We don't have such a concept. There are slight prophecies we see, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. We'll get into, is there prophecy today and what that looks like, what that experience is like today. But definitely the full experience of prophecy existed during the times of the first temple, but came to a stop really shortly after the first temple was destroyed. Now, there's a concept in Kabbalah, which is a very important concept, and we're going to be talking about this throughout this class. There's a concept in Hebrew, it's called Ze Leumat Ze Asa Elokim. Ze, this, Leumas, that opposes Ze, this, God creates. And the concept is like this. For every Superman, there's a Lex Luthor. For every positive energy, there's a negative energy. Any time that there's blessing in the world, there has to be, for the sake of keeping an equilibrium of good and bad, of free will, for every positive energy, there's also going to be there's going to be a version of that can be corrupted. So, for example, let's just see something that we might see today. The more love that's in the world, the more there's also going to be the potential for promiscuity. Which is why if you look at, let's say, eras, if you look at generations who wanted to promote the idea of free love and meant it well, often that same generation also became entrapped in more promiscuous behavior. That's an example of zeh l'umas zeh asa Elokim. Also, the same thing for that same reason also, when we're in a relationship and we invest a lot in a relationship, that same relationship that can add so much to our life can also create just as much pain. Because there always has to be an equilibrium between what can go right and what can go wrong. Otherwise, we would not honestly be creatures of free will. Does that make sense? Any questions, if you have any specific questions on that? Let me think if I could think of other examples. Let's just say, I'll give another example. I see that Trish is still struggling. Trish, I see you're struggling to get on. I don't think it's anything from our end, if you hear me. No, I just don't even hear me because she's on the thing. Okay, I don't know. But I'm going to send
Rabbi?
you, if you hear me, I'm going to send you the recording. Yes, question.
Yes, just a quick question. This is Devin. Does that mean that anytime something good happens that we experience it somewhere else in the world, something bad happens at the same time?
It doesn't mean that something bad happens. It means that it could be the exact opposite. It could be that there was potential for something bad to happen, but somehow, if we merited, we took that and were able to translate that into good. So it doesn't necessarily mean it will manifest itself as a good thing or a bad thing, but it means that the same potential, the same energy can be used for good and for bad. Let's just say another example. Just if you look at recent events, any movement that we have, I think this is something that we can all agree on and all see. Any movement which is pushing for positive change, almost inevitably has within it a branch or an offshoot that uses that to wreak havoc. Take a look at this past year, and you need to look no further. Right? So that means that on the coattails of trying to push for positive change, let's take this and let's manipulate it, either to cause damage, to cause chaos, or to sell things. Right? Let's say if you take a movement, and please allow me to be vague, but if, let's say, there's a movement that is happening that is branding itself to be a movement for positive change, and that movement has associated with it a slogan or a hashtag or whatever it is, and then as you begin to research that, if, let's say, whatever that slogan is, you Google it, you come to the website, and then the first thing that you see on the website is shop. You have across the thing, event, shop. Okay, so now you click and like, all right, what are they all about? That sounds like a good thing. What do they really do? Not sure, not exactly clear from the website. Shop. Ooh, check out that merch, right? You can make a good living over this. So then immediately one has to wonder. Now again, listen, I'm in the nonprofit business. I know the needs for nonprofits to have funding, and I know that we all create all sorts of ways because we need to have funding, right? I feel guilty charging ever for a class. Why should I make money? This is God's Torah that I'm trying to teach, right? But we got to keep the organization going. So I have no problem with that, but yet sometimes you get the sense that the whole thing, is it really all about the movement, or is it all about, selling merchandise? Or is it all about an agenda? Is it all about power? Is it all about fame, right? When you see, to me, anytime that a pop star, especially a young, I'm not talking about like more mature, who there's some who we've seen are authentic, right? But when a pop star is jumping on a movement and is the first one posting on their Instagram, with the hashtag, you wonder, like, are you really about the movement, or are you just, is that sort of what's trending? So any movement, and again, jump in if I'm not making sense, or if I'm being too vague, right? But any movement, any energy that enters into the world can be used for positive or can be manipulated for the negative. Larry, yeah.
Yeah, okay, we're talking about human nature here also. When you mention hashtag looking at things, we're dealing at a time when a lot of people are so afraid to make their own decisions. Buy this because your friend has it, or something pops up. This article takes only 5 minutes to read. We're dealing with a decay of people who can make decisions on their own. So there are always going to be leeches that feed off of people like that. So no matter what causes, I mean, if you look at, you want to see something really diametrically opposed, look at politics and who's saying what about what. I mean, there's good versus evil on the front page of the paper all the time. But that doesn't mean that anyone who believes in, let's say, acknowledging that COVID exists, stuff, I mean, we want to be specific, people who do that, and will there be people on the side who say, yeah, this can of whatever is going to kill everything and that can make money off it. But is that like part of God's plan, or is it's a part of people being stupid?
Those are both true. Those are both true, right? The reality is that anything that has holiness, anything that has holiness is going to have the potential to be manipulated, because again, it could be because there are stupid people. It could be there are weak people. It could be that whatever it is. Yeah, you're right. That is, yes, human nature, 100%. Human nature has the ability to take something good, and because there is that dark side of human beings, there is that potential to take something good and now try to manipulate it, try to play on people's fears, play on people's insecurities, right? Whatever it is. And it's always been like that. So therefore, as you track history, whatever the movement is, whatever the energy is, you'll always see the zeh l'umazeh. Randy, were you going to ask a question?
Well, now you're saying you'll always see. So I was going to say, I mean, if there's positive, does that mean that, the negative doesn't necessarily have to show up, right?
Correct. But the reality is that you will always see what I said. Hold on 1 second, I just want to let someone in. What I told Devin before is, it doesn't mean that necessarily every single event will play out in two ways, but it does. But definitely, when we're speaking about movements and ideologies, you'll usually see how it's being applied for the good, and how or again, listen, I think if you talk about. This is not what I was referring to before, but for the moment, if you talk about liberalism, right, which is such a beautiful, the idea of being progressive and the idea of becoming more tolerant, I mean, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful, and you can see at its core, right, that it's certainly God's desire. But then I think, again, as mature adults, we can look around and we can point to how it's being applied in various situations and say, like, we're going a little bit, overboard, or are we, moving beyond, and what's behind that. So I think that's a wonderful example of where you see today. You see that a movement that, again, I do believe is something that at its core is godly. Right? In Kabbalah, the term for that, it's called the klipa. The klipa, the husk, the klipa, like the literal translation of klipa is a husk. Like if you take a nut or if you take a fruit, the shell that's around it is called the klipa. So what you see is that at the core, there's something good there, but yet the husks, which is, the dark side, if you will latch onto it and say, okay, let's jump onto this good thing and let's see how we can corrupt it. So what about if you take something as holy and as beautiful as prophecy? So what is the corruption of prophecy? The corruption of prophecy is idol worship. Again, because to us, idol worship, when we think of idol worship, we think of something as very, very primitive. But then again, we make a mistake and we think that because we're scientifically sophisticated, we're also spiritually sophisticated. The truth is that it's not true. Today, we're more scientifically advanced than we've ever been, but we're also more spiritually primitive than we've ever been. That means that if you take a look at the ancient world was much more intuitively spiritual. Now, how did that manifest itself within the world of holiness? It manifests itself in prophets. Not only in the Jewish people. The Jewish people are not we don't lay claim to have the only prophets. There were non-Jewish prophets as well. There are prophets in other religions also. But prophecy also has a dark side to it, and that's called idol worship. So often when we paint a picture for our children of a bunch of, weird people bowing down to a big statue, which seems so primitive, that really wasn't what idol worship was about. Idol worship was a high that felt like a spiritual high, but it really was not. It was really coming from something else. The same way that one might say that if one had a chemically induced spiritual experience, that can give them access to a very, very holy place. And it could also be a really bad trip, which can traumatize a person for life. Depends on the person's mental state. So therefore, even when we look throughout the book of prophets and we see the concept of false prophets, they themselves might not have been aware that it was false prophets, but it just could be that the mechanisms that they used to achieve that psychedelic state were the wrong ones, and therefore they're messing with themselves and messing with their own minds. That's a form of idol worship. That's much of the early idol worship, and that's one of the reasons why, and I think we might have even said this in this class, though I don't remember when or why we would have said it, but if you go back and you read about many of the idol worshiping that happened during the time of the first temple and prior to that, going back to even the generation after Shlomo HaMelech, many of them, they really meant well. But they were so mistaken that the power of the spiritual experience of their time was so enticing that if you couldn't get it in a holy way, then you went to get it in a non-holy way. What that can be compared to with, let's say today, is if you think about how sex is can create such connection. It can be the holiest bonding experience between two people. And yet it could also turn into the most animalistic expression of a human being. And how is it possible that something that can be such an enlightening, powerful, beautiful experience, what experience in this world is more beautiful? And yet what experience in this world is also more dirty? And it really just depends. And it's amazing to see how the very, very same thing can go to the two extremes. Well, that's the way we understand it today. That's what idol worship was. That was the relationship between idol worship and prophecy in the world of the first temple, and in the ancient world before that. And after the first temple is destroyed, prophecy stops, prophecy ceases, And idol worship does as well. And really, the reason that prophecy ended was actually, according to the Talmud, was because idol worship had become so, the lust for idol worship, the drive for idol worship had become so powerful that God says idol worship has become so powerful it will destroy the world if we don't turn down the wattage. And when you turn down the wattage on evil, you also have to turn down the wattage on good. And if the and in our world today, if let's say God decided, you know what, the sex drive is so strong we got to turn it down, then we would affect that would affect also the ability for that to be used as a vehicle for love as well, because it's always zel umazeh. There's always that equilibrium. Adrian, you had a question. You're
Okay.
on mute.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a gray area that, and maybe you can explain what was idol worship.
So idol worship was back then. Idol worship was a way of tapping in to intermediaries, not having to go through channels, the difficult channels of personal holiness, for one to get themselves into a state of prophecy, right? Which in order to get into a state of prophecy, one had to have extreme personal holiness and very strong discipline, and be able to awaken their prophetic mind, which we all have, right? But your prophetic mind by calming, by using God's name and putting oneself in to a place of personal holiness, so that they felt this dynamic, this electric connection between themselves and God, that they no longer felt like a body, an emotion, a thought, but they felt like a soul and connected with God in that way. And that same trip, so to speak, except without the personal holiness, without using the names of God, by using more synthetic and inauthentic means to get there, that was idol worship. And how would they do that? There would be all sorts of ways in which they would do that. But clearly we see that it gave a high to them in whatever means that they used. They gave them a similar sense of trying to get out of this space of being just trapped in this physical world. It gave them that same same sense of vastness, but in a very unholy way.
So today it could be like going to a tarot card reader. Is that kind of a connection that's a false prophet?
Yeah, those things can be considered. And again, even if let's say the person is authentic, but by the very nature that they're using means that the Torah does not allow, that itself could be idol worship. Because any time that an intermediary that's not God, an intermediary spiritual force is being used, right, to go beyond natural means, it's idol worship unless the Torah says that one is allowed to do that.
Okay.
Renee, yeah.
You said, though, that the idol worship stopped after First Temple, but some religions still have idol worship today.
But again, I said that the wattage was turned down.
Or just turned down.
Yeah, and it could be that they have the rituals. I don't know necessarily that anyone does. But again, modern idol worship issues really come up, especially in the world. It's a fine line when you go into the world of energy healing. There are, depending on what means they use, not all energy healing is problematic, but some are. I don't remember, although I did research this a little bit once. Reiki was problematic, and I know that that's something that's very, very popular, because there are definitely practices even today that are trying to awaken spirits, that are trying to, or tarot reading or things like that. So there definitely is idol worship today. Some people get into it, they don't even realize they're doing it. There are problems today, but definitely the wattage is turned down in terms of getting to those states that they got to then, which were the equivalent, so to speak, of a prophetic state that we don't have anymore. Yeah, Larry.
So was drug use prevalent among those people way back then? Because to get to an ecstatic state, it doesn't sound like it sounds like there was some other means.
One would assume that those things were used, and even if they weren't, definitely the experience was somewhat related to that.
Interesting.
So, but yeah, I mean, if you look at ancient idol worship practices, one would wonder whether those things were used. So after the first temple is destroyed, that comes to an end. And because that comes to an end, that sounds tragic, because obviously, as human beings, like, we want to be able to experience our full selves. And if there's more to us than just this tangible experience that we have from day to day, we want to know about it. That was the pull towards the psychedelic experience. Whenever it, in the 60s, or whenever it became something, and it's still today, and still there are people, there are lots of studies today that are trying to bring those things back into the circle of practice, and trying to activate higher human consciousness, because as human beings, if there is more, then we should know about it. We should be able to use it. And it should be something that's very, very holy and that's very special. But there is an advantage to turning that off. What is the advantage to turning that off? So to quote, what was his name? That big guru came to America. He was like big in like Hollywood.
Maharishi?
Which one was? I know that was Maharishi. Was he the Beatles one?
Yeah.
I don't know if it was Maharishi. No, Osho. Osho, not Maharishi. There was a Osho, who also had some sort of other funny name, but Osho, who, if you look him up, Osho, he was also big in Hollywood, and anyways, you'll look him up. But he has said a lot of brilliant things. Although even towards the end of his life, he got into drugs and he got into all sorts of weird things. After they brought him to America, I think America corrupted him. Maybe he was corrupt before, but I think being the Hollywood guru kind of corrupted him a little bit. But he said something. He said the difference between the East and the West is that the East is rich spiritually, but impoverished physically, and the West is rich physically but impoverished spiritually, something like that. And the reality is that, and again, now things might be somewhat changing, but the reality is that when you're so connected to this prophetic experience, to this out of body, to this bigger than oneself, it does slow down human advancement. Why? Because why would I be into this physical world if there's something so much bigger? If I could access the pleasure of being soulful, of being enlightened, then what does that say about the human physical experience? And because of that, it is not a coincidence that in time, and again, right, when we're speaking about the bigger scheme of time, we're not talking about 5 years later, 10 years later, right? Even if we say something happens 200 years later, in the scheme of human history, that's not a lot of time, right? Because it takes time for the development of new waves, of new movements, right? So if you take a look at when Greece comes into human history, and you see that Greece and the movement that they created, the human advancement, which was incredible. There's no empire, there's no nation in history who developed the human condition as much as ancient Greece. And everything that they introduced into the world, from art to math to science, government, democracy, culture, poetry, right? The list goes on, architecture, goes on and on and on and on. These were the physical form, beauty. These were amazing, amazing human accomplishments. But it's no coincidence that it entered into the stream of human development only after prophecy died down. Because when the world was filled with prophecy, and therefore not only prophecy, but paganism, right? And those two, I don't want to call them partners. No, it would be terrible to say partners in crime. But those two extremes, both in the world of holiness and in the world of impurity, until that was able to die down, and now we were much more connected to the human physical experience. Now suddenly the doors are open to say, okay, us as physical beings in this world who are not as connected to the spirit, but are much more connected to the body, the emotion, and the intellect, the lower levels of the intellect, what can we now develop in this state that we are? And it's into that world where now prophecy and paganism has now, the door has been shut on those things, that now we're able to develop in a new way. And Greece can enter and say, wow, as human beings, as physical beings, if we're down to earth, look at what we could accomplish. We don't need prophets for our development. We don't need these ecstatic experiences. We can develop beauty right here on this world. And that was the foundation of Greek ideology. And that's actually something that's very, very beautiful, except ze l'uma ze. There's always the good and there's always the bad that comes along with that. And the bad, the impurity, the contamination that comes along with discovering, wow, as human beings, we can do that. What is the contamination of that? You can say it.
It doesn't include Hashem.
It doesn't include, which means we say, wow, well, if we can do that, then we don't need God.
Right.
It's the scientist that says, if I can prove everything, then I don't need to believe in God. If I can show that everything happens, then why believe in God? Right? So therefore, so now at this point, we can go in two directions. We could say that because we've realized the tremendous beauty and the tremendous power of the human being, now we can say, wow, now we have the ability to become so much closer to God. Because now we've discovered that us as human beings, we actually have the ability to emulate God on this world. God is a creator, and we can create. And take all that and turn all of that into a new type of spiritual experience. Or we can say, one second, we don't need God anymore, because we just figured out that we can do all of this. We could create an amazing, beautiful human world that lacks all spirituality. We discover the beauty of the human body. So we can take that and we can say, okay, the human body is beautiful. Or we can take that and we say, okay, now let's flaunt it. Let's use it as an object of lust. And that happens on every single level. That happens on every single level, where now what's happening with Greece is that what begins as something that has the potential for holiness is now being taken and being corrupted to be used as a way to say, okay, now let's push God out of it. Any questions about this so far? Yeah.
But in the end, yes, they were more physical, and the physicality, which I asked you last week in reference to Chanukah, that one of the things they pushed the Jews was towards the physicality, but they also had the idol worship. They had gods.
Yeah, but if you take a look at their gods, the way they viewed their gods, that was not, their gods were not, let's become spiritual and let's now humble ourselves towards our God. I mean, you see the Greek mythology, the gods have even bigger problems. Each one of these gods literally needs therapy. They need like an anonymous group for their gods. Their gods are more corrupt than them. Right? They ascribed all of the impurities within man to their gods. So their gods were just symbolisms of all of their own corruption. Okay. That being said, if that's all happening, if Greece is now becoming the channel, the conduit for the world to move from a prophetic and pagan state into a new experience, and they have to now work out their own version of the free will struggle within that world, remember that within the Jewish world, prophecy has also ended. And if for the first over 1,000 years of Jewish people, we were a prophet-reliant people, we were people that turned to our prophets for direction. By the way, that means to say that even if you were not a prophet, even if you didn't have the official prophet certification, degree in the Jeremiah School of Prophecy, right? Even if you didn't have it, right, you were more in tune to the prophetic experience, right? We're all affected by the zeitgeist of whatever is going on, whether we're in the heart of it or not. Right? We're American. My kids are born. They adopt on their own American values, whether they're directly taught them or not. It becomes part of the stream of human consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I always like to say with people, they say, "Oh, why do I need Judaism?" Right? Of course, those are my values. These are my values. My values are love and like, where do you think those values come from? Those are Jewish values. You might not have learned them as Jewish values because they've become so mainstream, right? But they're Jewish values. So our consciousness is always fine-tuned to whatever the energy is. Whatever the energy that's out there in the world, whatever the waves are, we're in tune to that, whether we're in the heart of it or whether we're just nourishing from it. So every single Jew, whether they were a certified prophet or just a Jew, was in tune with that prophetic Wi-Fi that existed then. So what happens to the Jewish people once prophecy comes to an end? Obviously, that's going to change. So now you could look at it in two ways. You could say, okay, prophecy is gone, that's terrible. This has now been a major downgrade of the Jewish people. But when you look over at the world of Greece, you see, one second, that the world of prophecy ended, and suddenly something else just happened. Once we gave space for the human being to sort of pull themselves away from the spiritual world, suddenly they discovered a whole new stream of human potential. Well, that exact same thing is going to happen in the Jewish world in the most amazing way. So take a look over here once again. If you look over here at the timeline, so we see over here, 5th century, let's go through this quickly. The 5th century BCE is the end of the era of prophecy. The 4th century BCE is the beginning of the Second Temple. Also, the conquests of Alexander the Great, spreading Greek culture, what they call Syrian-Greek culture, but what we refer to now as Greek culture, and beginning the process of cultural change called Hellenization. So after the era of prophecy ends, we're now grasping what's next. What's the next human movement? So when prophecy comes to an end, one can understand that within the world of spirituality, we're like, holy cow, we just lost our crutch. We just lost our connection. Time to assimilate, because that's the next best thing. That's the trend, right? That's the fashion of the season. If we no longer have prophecy anymore, if we can no longer connect in that way, right? Then let's enter into that world of Greece. Let's enter into that world of human development, because that's clearly the zeitgeist. That's clearly the movement. So that's why we see specifically there, we see the rise of Greece, and we see this movement of Hellenization, of assimilation. And then it's in that world, once we open ourselves up, once we become vulnerable, 2nd century BCE, that's when Antiochus comes in, takes power, results in harsh persecutions against the Jews. The Maccabees revolt, and then something fascinating happens. Immediately after that, immediately after we say, no, we're taking back our religion, but what's it going to look like now? What's it going to look like when there's no more prophets? Suddenly, this happens. The era of the Tanaim. Are you familiar with what a Tana is? The Tana, those are the authors of the Mishnah. Those are the authors of the Mishnah. That means that the Mishnah itself, again, the Mishnah itself was compiled really shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple. Right, so it was really it was a long process which began 1st century CE, but the conversations that are contained in the Mishnah go all the way back to pretty much 2nd century BCE. That means, what does that mean? That means pretty much that as the Maccabees, as this world is changing, as the world of prophecy is fading, suddenly the world of the Tanaim, which is the world of the oral Torah, is now suddenly developing. Suddenly we're starting to have these fascinating conversations as to how to interpret the Torah. Now I see that we're running out of time, and I'm going to take just another 5 minutes and speak a little bit faster, and then maybe we'll just clarify the point next time. This is such a powerful point. The oral Torah, you've heard of the oral Torah, right? Torah Sheba'al Peh. Yes? You've heard of it. The oral Torah wasn't invented in the 2nd century BCE, or 3rd century BCE, or 4th. The oral Torah is something that goes back to Sinai. There's no Torah without an oral Torah. If you've ever decided, right, you decided you fell in love here with this book. Oh my gosh, I'm inspired. I want to learn Torah. So you decide you're going to go to synagogue every single Shabbat, and you're going to pay close attention. You're going to get an English version, and you're going to study it as close as you could. You have the English version, you have a Spanish version, whatever it is. You're memorizing it. You're memorizing every single word. But that's all you know. Have you made yourself, you could recite it forward and backwards. Are you a Torah scholar? Absolutely not. You might be a biblical scholar, but you are a very, very confused Jew. Because what you have done is you have read a book that was never, ever meant to be an independent book. This is a book that was given over together with an entire course that goes along with it. What is that course called? The oral Torah. So what does that mean now suddenly? And again, we know that the Mishnah, we know that the oral Torah was written down after the destruction of the Second Temple, because it was at that point that the rabbis led by Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, the rabbis were concerned, what's going to be with Torah? The Jewish people are going into exile. There's no more temple. We better put the course down also. Because we can no longer rely on teachers, on rabbis, on leaders. The course has to be written down. So in addition to the written Torah, they wrote the Mishnah, they wrote the Talmud as a way that the course should be written down as well. But the question is, when you look at it, when you open up the Mishnah and you open up the Talmud, the conversations that are happening are conversations that happened in the 2nd century BCE. Well, there was an oral Torah for hundreds and hundreds of years before that. So why are these conversations happening now? If you look at the Talmud can be 5 pages of a dynamic discussion on a verse in the Torah. So where is all of this coming from? And the answer is that when prophecy stopped, suddenly something happened which seemed very frightening. Suddenly, Jews looked in the Torah and it wasn't as clear as it was before. Now, that might seem very, very frightening. Oh my gosh, we're losing our prophets, we're losing our understanding of the Torah. But something incredible happened. Conversations which created even greater enlightenment, even greater understanding of the Torah than the Jewish people ever had before, from the moment that the Torah was given at Sinai, through that entire era of prophecy. Now suddenly they're understanding it in a whole new level of depth. Why? Why is that? Because for this entire, it's 12:55 now. For the entire 55 minutes that we've been sitting here together, you've been listening to me talk, and I haven't given you a moment to think. But the minute that I end this, and if you decide that you want to spend the next 10 minutes thinking about this class, you're going to have all these new questions, right? You're going to have all the, oh, that, and maybe you'll put it together with something that we did in class last year. Maybe you'll start, maybe you'll say, hey, I read something like that. So for the next 20 minutes, if you decide to put your mind to it, suddenly you're going to come up with all new amazing things, but you need me to zip my mouth. For 1,000 years, or whatever it was, from when the Torah was given, they were hearing the voice of prophecy. God was speaking at them for that whole time. And yes, was it an amazing experience? Yes, it was. But it did not allow for human development. So in the secular world, the world of Greece, what they're saying is, okay, once prophecy's turned off, we can now develop the physical world. In the Jewish world, they're saying, okay, we can now develop Torah in a whole new way. There's going to be a new depth of Torah that's going to come out, not that's going to be rained upon us from God, but a new wellspring of Torah that's going to come from us. And listen to this, something absolutely fascinating. And again, I'm going to end with this, and then in the beginning of the next class, I just want to add a little bit more to it, but we are running out of time. Something amazing. I forgot to put this on the handout, and you'll excuse me. But there's a fascinating line from Socrates, where he says, I'm not going to try to quote it because I don't remember it, but pretty much in a nutshell, if anyone has ever read the book by Steve Pressburg, or something called the War of Art, not the Art of War, the War of Art, where he speaks about how to refine a person's creative abilities. A really cool book. And he speaks a lot about art and how it developed in the world of Greece. And this is where I actually read that quote, where he says that Socrates says that any artist, pretty much in a nutshell what he's saying is, any artist who doesn't believe that their art is a form of prophecy, that their art is coming to them from some sort of outside source, is limiting themselves to really a very, 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 very basic form of art. The true artist understands that this is coming to them from some outside source, right? And again, we see this even now with musicians, with poets, with artists. They'll say, like, this came to me, like, some sort of prophetic way. They themselves realize that. Anyone who writes a lot, right, that just sometimes it starts out as you, and then it just goes through you, it just flows through you. Right? I remember even now, and I'm working, God willing, I hope that within the next half a year, I will have published a book that I really worked a lot over the summer, and I had the privilege of finishing it up over the summer, being in Colorado, having a little bit of quiet, and being sort of in that environment, which was really the perfect place to really just put the final touches. And it was the third draft of the book that I wrote. And as I'm writing this third draft, literally, I cannot even tell you. And again, I don't have a wonderful vocabulary. I have a yeshiva education, and God, you'll all read it, and there's nothing there. It's easy to there's a lot there, but the reading of it it's easy to read. But at certain points, I'm just I'm writing, and an idea comes. I'm like, where did that come from? Or a word comes, and I'm like, I've never used that word in my entire life. I barely know what it means, but yet it seems so perfect right here. And then I'd be like, let me just check to make sure we're using it right. And I'd Google it, and literally it would be the exact word that I'm looking for. And I'm like, I've never used that word before. Maybe I heard it twice, but it's so perfect now. Something flows through you. And that's coming from Socrates. That's coming from someone in the world of art, in the world of Greece, in the world of philosophy. In the world of Torah, something is happening. It seems that prophecy has ended, but prophecy really has not ended. It's just coming in a different direction now. Instead of the prophet feeling as if God is coming, is overpowering him, instead he's looking inwards and he's discovering that, one second, it feels like my own idea, but this is also the word of God. And that's why the oral Torah, the Talmud, the Mishnah, we're going to end with this, is such a fascinating document, because on the one hand, it's human conversations. But on the other hand, from the perspective of the world of Torah, the world of Torah looks at it as this too is the word of God. But not the word of God coming down at Sinai, blowing our brains out. The word of God coming through the human being. And obviously done by using the specific tools, the specific guidelines. Otherwise, anyone can be a charlatan and say, hey, this is the word of God because I'm saying it. So obviously, it has to conform itself to the rules of Talmud, to the rules of Torah study. But within that box, within that framework, within those guidelines, suddenly there's now a whole new wellspring of ideas, Kabbalistic ideas, ideas in Jewish law, all across the board. It's the new development. So again, we'll continue this next week and we'll get into it a little bit more and we can ask more questions now. But the Chanukah story, the light of the menorah itself, and that's one of the reasons why you'll notice we light 36 lights over the course of Chanukah. There's a lot more depth to that. Caroline will get to that next week, the depth of the 36 lights. We'll go through it a little bit more. But just as a teaser, how many tractates of Talmud are there? 36 tractates of Talmud. Right? So that the menorah, by the way, itself represented the oral Torah. So that means that that Chanukah, this war against the Greeks, this development of the oral Torah, this is specifically happening now because this is the response. This is the new prophecy. This is prophecy 2.0, which though it seems like a downgrade, it's really not a downgrade. It's actually an upgrade. It feels like a downgrade because it's coming from us, but it's an upgrade because it shows that the human being doesn't need to have prophecy to become a prophet. Actually, I think that would have sounded better the other way. A human being doesn't need to be a prophet to experience prophecy. However way you like it. I'll have to play with that one a little bit. Anyhow, that's the idea. And again, we'll sort of seal that a little bit better next week. But in the meantime, something to carry with you as you're lighting the menorah, just to think about really what the menorah represents. So let's end the class for now. And again, if anyone wants to ask a question, but we'll clarify this a little bit more in the beginning of